Hey everyone, I'm Alex Loubere. I'm an avid fly fisherman. I have been for the last 18 or so years. I like to fly fish for dang near anything that swims, warm water and cold water. And today I'm going to tie one of my favorite carp patterns. Carp fishing is growing in popularity across the country, and there's no better place to catch carp than here in Arizona. So let's get started. To start with, we'll talk a little bit about we have two different kinds of carp, common carp and grass carp, that are most often found in our waters. This is a pattern I tie for common carp, and it's designed to be fished off the bottom where common carp most often feed actively. This is tied on a jig hook with a long shank, and the long shank gives me some opportunity to add a little bit more materials. And throughout the course of this tie, I'm going to kind of go through some of my philosophies when it comes to tying flies, specifically carp flies, and how I balance materials to make this thing swim properly. But I'm just going to go ahead and get started and get some thread on the hook. I already attached my dumbbell eyes. I like to batch prep these using some Loctite super glue to make sure they really stay put. And I don't want to bore you with tying on those. If you have any trouble with your dumbbell eyes, go ahead and hit YouTube. There's tons and tons of videos on how to do that. So these are bead chain eyes, so they don't have a ton of weight. I find carp are very sensitive to splash. So I want to have something that's just heavy enough to get down into the feeding zone without making a big old splash when it hits the water and potentially spooking the fish. But I am going to add a little bit of weight to help it. These bead chain are not quite heavy enough, I've found in a lot of cases, to really keel the fly so it rides hook point up. So I'm going to use a little bit of this hairline lead-free wire, and I'm just going to wrap 5 or 6 turns around the hook shank here, kind of right up near the top. So what I like to do with this wire is I like to leave myself a little bit of tag, and I like to start my twists by holding both ends, and this allows me to get really tight wraps, and I can kind of use my fingers here to make sure those wraps get really tight. And I'm going to give it like 1, 2, 3, 4, like about 8 wraps here before I trim it using my scissors. Probably not the best practice to use your nice scissors to trim lead wire, but here we are. Cinch that up, give it one more good little turn, and then nip that off right there. And then I kind of use my fingers to take those burrs sticking up and just kind of mash them down a little bit. I don't want those sticking up and interfering with the materials I try to lay down on top of that. So now we've got this nice little spiral of wire, and that's going to add a little bit of weight and help that orient itself in the water when it lands. When we're carp fishing, a lot of the times we're using what's called a drag and drop technique, where we're casting away from the fish so that we don't spook it, and then quickly moving the fly in front of the fish to initiate a bite. That means I need my fly to swim correctly even if I'm dragging it kind of quick, and that's kind of what this weight is there for, is to help make sure that hook stays riding point up so that I don't do all this work to present to a carp and end up snagging the bottom when the crucial moment comes and I don't get my fish. So I'm just going to do some loose wraps over the top of that to kind of cover that wire up a little bit, and then I'll sort of tighten my wraps, and that's all nice and crazy glued in so that it's not going to go anywhere. So we've got our weight system in. Now let's build the tail. For the tail, I'm going to use this stuff. It's called F&F chewing gum worm, and this is the brandling color, so it's like a blood red, like midge colored. And the neat stuff about this chenille, you can kind of see it's got a bunch of rubber legs sort of built into the chenille. So when this stuff gets wet, it moves like crazy, and I found it's very successful in tempting carp to bite. So I'm going to take like a little piece of that, maybe about 1.5 times the length of the shank of the hook that I'm working with, and I'm just going to snip it off with my scissors here. And in order to prep, I'm going to kind of stretch it a little bit so that any of its natural kinks that it has are kind of worked out. We want it to be kind of nice and straight. And then I'm going to use a lighter to kind of taper the end of this thing. And what that does is it not only tapers it, but it also seals that chenille material off so that you don't have it unravel on you after catching a few fish. Now, watch your eyebrows. This is my big lighter. Oop. Try not to light it on fire like I just did. If you do, see how you got a little like scorched end there? You can kind of just nip that off and you're in good shape. So here's my piece. of tail here. I'm gonna line it up so that I've got about the hook shank's length worth of tail coming off the back end of this fly. So I'm gonna take my thread, I'm kind of spinning it up here so that it gets nice and thin. And I'm just gonna give it one loose wrap, two loose wraps, and cinch down, making sure that that stays on the top of the hook shank for me. I don't want that twisting around, because if it twists around to the other side, it's gonna be much more likely to foul on you, which again, you only usually get one shot at a carp when it's feeding. You don't want your tail to be all fouled on your hook and goof up your presentation when you have a shot at, you know, a 20+ pound fish. So I'm just trimming some of those errant rubber legs off so that I can totally cover them with thread base. And that looks pretty good, so I'll rotate it upside down, give that a little tug, make sure it wants to stay in the right spot. Now we'll just cover that up nice and good with thread there. So next, we're gonna build the body, which is gonna be a mixture of this brown possum dubbing here. It's a little bit of a longer fur dubbing, and then this stuff called hairline shaggy dub. And this is, I don't know why they even call it dubbing. It's basically just micro rubber legs. So I'm actually gonna mix this with the possum to make my own kind of custom dubbing blend of sort of a buggy fur with rubber legs sticking out, that when that thing falls in the water, those rubber legs are just pulsing. And I've had some really good luck with carp eating this fly. So I build my dubbing loop here, wrap behind the loop that I'm holding with my finger, wrap in front. Sometimes I'll do a double wrap behind if it feels like it doesn't want to stay. And then I'm just gonna walk my thread basically up to the front of the fly, because this dubbing loop is gonna comprise almost our entire body here. Now I'll take my handy dandy dubbing twister, hook it on, and just kind of let it dangle. And then I'll hit those double threads with some good old-fashioned dubbing wax, just to make it so that the material wants to stay where I put it. So now I'm gonna take a pretty generous pinch, probably something like, about like that much possum dubbing. Always take a little bit more than you think you need, because when you start spreading it out on that hook, it's gonna really start to get thin on you, and you don't want the body to be kind of like mangy looking where there's bald patches and stuff like that. I'm sure the carp don't care, but I do. So I want my flies to look symmetrical and consistent. And all I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of rip stacking these fibers to get them to line up with each other. So I want them all kind of laying fairly parallel. And once I've accomplished that and gotten all the deer hair butts from other flies that I was tying with this dubbing out of there, I'll kind of just lay that off to the side for now and pick up my shaggy dub. So the shaggy dub is a little bit more tricky to work with because it's rubber legs, kind of hard to hold on to, and getting them to line up can be a bit of a pain. So I'm gonna actually take a pretty sparse pinch, because you'll see with this stuff a little bit goes a really long way. So I've got some like mid-size legs in here, and I've got some like really stupidly long ones. So typically what I do is I kind of just get it pinched up to where I've got most of them laying pretty flat. And then I'm gonna look at those really stupid long ones, and I'm gonna trim them off and just work them into the pile of dubbing. So I just trim that off. I'm gonna flip it over and stick it back in the stack here. And then I've got one off the left side that I'm gonna trim off and stick back in the stack here. So now, and I keep losing them, which is pretty typical. These things are really difficult to hang on to, but you'll get the hang of it. So I've got this decent stack of somewhat similarly lengthed pieces of rubber. I've got a longer one here that I might trim and throw back in. So now I'm gonna kind of get it to where I'm at the midpoint of this stack, and I'm gonna bend it over my index finger like that. So now I've got kind of halfway through the stack. I'm gonna take my scissor and I'm just gonna run it between my finger and those rubber legs and chop them right in half. So now I've got, that stack is now cut in half. I'm gonna take my possum dubbing And with my right hand, I'm just gonna kind of envelop those rubber legs with the possum dubbing as best as I can so that everybody's laying parallel. So I've got this like hot mess right here that I'm then gonna start to rip stack to try and work those rubber legs into the body of the possum dubbing and kind of really blend everything together so you get a dubbing that is hopefully full of equally distributed bits of rubber leg throughout. It's looking pretty decent right now. There's always going to be a few that don't want to behave themselves, but that's okay. So we've got this stack of rubber-legged possum dubbing now. It can go into our dubbing loop. So I'll open this up using my free hand. Just put that in there, let it pinch closed, and now I can kind of use my fingers. I can even set this down so I can pull counter tension using my fingers and manipulate this stack of fur and rubber legs and get it sort of nice and evenly spaced out. I want to be able to see daylight through this. And the reason is that if I get this too dense and wind this on the hook, I'm going to have too much material for the weight to make sure that this rides up. So when this thing's getting pulled through the water, you've got water tension on it, right? It's being pulled, there's water pushing against it. If the material here is too dense, you're gonna end up with a fly that wants to spin around itself because it's gonna overpower the center of gravity created by the weight you put on. So you gotta make sure this is nice and sparse while still being able to cover the hook shank. It's kind of a delicate balance you wanna strike with these flies. It also helps with sink rate, right? Too much material on there, it's not gonna sink fast enough, you're gonna miss out on fish. So I've got that pretty well spaced out. I'm gonna hold it here, and what I like to do with these dubbing loops to make sure they spin up nice and tight is I pinch them and don't let them spin, and then I'm flicking that dubbing spinner to get a bunch of tension, and then when I let go, it spins up nice and tight. So I'm gonna give that another couple spins, and then I'm gonna take this nice dubbing brush tool here, which is basically just like a soft plastic bore brush from a gun. This one's made specifically for tying. You can use a bore brush, but it will potentially scuff your thread up since those are metal brushes. This is plastic, so it doesn't hurt your thread. And I'm just gonna use my little tool here to start to agitate this and kind of break loose that possum so that we get a little bit thinner of a core and we get more buggy fur bits coming out of this so that when we wind it, it's got some nice body to it. So keep picking away at that. If I see any rubber legs that are kind of looped, you notice here with this dubbing loop that these rubber legs they're in there, but they're not like super dense, because when you start to wind this on, if you have too many rubber legs, it looks kind of goofy. So I like to have sort of a little bit of rubber legs relative to the possum and not mostly rubber legs. So I've got that there. What I'm going to do now is just put a half hitch, which is just dropping the thread over the top of itself, putting that loop onto the fly, and then letting it sink down. And what that does, keeps the thread from unraveling. As I rotate the vise, that half hitch will just kind of follow around and make sure that my thread stays exactly where I want it, because I'm going to use the rotary function of my vise here to start to wind this dubbing loop on. And I kind of take my time here and comb this back with my fingers. I don't want to let some of those rubber legs get facing forward if I can help it, because then they don't lay back when the fly is swimming and they make the fly swim kind of goofy. They end up looking kind of goofy, and I don't want that. So here, carp flies are supposed to look goofy, but only in specific ways. I don't want them to look goofy and disheveled in the ways that I don't want. It's hard to explain. But so I'm just kind of winding this around, and you notice these rubber legs are kind of working themselves out of the dubbing loop as we go. That's okay. We've got plenty of rubber legs in here. Once I get to a certain point though, I'm going to start hand winding, because that gives me just a little bit more control over what's going on. Usually about when I get to where my lead wire is when I'm going to start hand winding this dubbing loop. and I'm just kind of pulling those fibers and those rubber legs backwards as I wind, just to make sure they're laying back the direction that I want. And notice I'm gonna almost get to the eyes. We're gonna stop a little bit, just a touch short, because we're gonna leave a little bit of room so we can build our head. So now I'm gonna tie that dubbing loop off just by wrapping around behind it a few times before I snip it. There's that. Follow that down, snip it free. Okay, so body's built. Now we just need to tease it out and kind of do a little bit of trimming work, because these rubber legs, a few of them are just a hair long. So I'm gonna do some reinforcing wraps just to make sure that doesn't want to go anywhere. Carp are pretty dang toothless. They don't do a ton of damage to flies, but I still try to build them so that I have some reinforcement to make sure that they last more than like 1 or 2 fish. They can do some work on flies if it's hooked, you know, on the tip of the mouth. They'll do some torsion work and really put a lot of pressure on a fly. So making sure that you're still tying these with durability in mind, I think, is important. So we've got some pretty long rubber legs that I'm just gonna clip out here real quick. I don't want any going like way past my tail, because the tail is kind of the star of the show here. The tail is the attractor part of this fly. Carp mudding or cruising, we'll see this thing with that little red tail sticking up, and it kind of just looks like a little midge or something that's poking out of the mud. And they really go nuts for this thing. Pull that. So that looks pretty dang good. Comb that out a little bit. Okay, probably trim that rubber leg too. So now we're ready to build our head, and for that I'm going to use a slightly different kind of dubbing. This is just brown hare's ear dubbing, just standard issue brown dubbing. It's a little bit shorter fiber than the possum, and that's so I can have sort of a longer fibered body that sort of blends into a little bit shorter fibered head. I've found that putting materials up here can be a bit of a dangerous game, because the action that I talked about wanting to make the fly spin is even more pronounced when you start putting a lot of bulky materials on the head. So instead of a dubbing loop here, I'm actually just gonna noodle this stuff on like you would dubbing up a trout fly or something like that. So same principles though, I still take a pinch and rip stack those fibers to get them moving all parallel to each other. And then I'm just gonna take a pinch of it, kind of spread it onto the thread, and I'm just gonna start to roll it and build myself a nice little dubbing noodle here. And this is a little bit easier than noodling trout flies, because I don't need to be very cognizant of how much dubbing I'm putting on this noodle, because I'm gonna need to put quite a bit in order to cover my figure 8 wraps really well and get a head that when I pick it out isn't going to show any bald spots. I really don't want to have bald spots, because not only do they look bad, they also make the fly swim kind of weird. So notice I'm kind of doubling up on a lot of my spots here. Get this nice kind of thick noodle on, and I'm going to start to wind it. So typically I take about 4 wraps in behind the eyes to build up kind of the neck area. So there, that looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna try to turn this so you can see. I'm gonna take 1 wrap here on this side. I'm gonna come underneath, and I'm gonna come around the second eye, and then I'm gonna go around the shank eye here and back around here, do a figure 8 around that eye, and then I'm going to come around the eye again in front and wrap up to finish. You may need to rewind and watch that a few times, but this is the method that I found that gets me the kind of the best coverage of those eyes, so that when I go to brush this head out, I don't end up with a bunch of bald spots underneath or on top. So now I'm just going to kind of reinforce and wrap sort of back down the eye a little bit to cover that dubbing up. And then I'm ready to whip finish. I'm gonna take my whip finishing tool, Again, if you need to learn how to use one of these, there's a ton of really good videos already on that. I won't waste a bunch of your time rehashing how to use a whip finisher. Cinch that tight. Gonna snip. And then I always like to reinforce a little bit of crazy glue. You can substitute Zap-A-Gap or any other head cement material for that. I like this stuff because it goes on very thin and it dries really fast. And I don't know, I've had people tell me that they don't use any kind of glue on carp flies because they think the scent throws off. I've caught a lot of carp on flies that I've tied. I use head cement on every single one and it does not seem to deter them one bit. So I'm just making sure that eye is clear there. And to finish, I'm just gonna brush this head dubbing out a little bit so that it kind of blends. You notice how as I start to pick it out and it gets a little scraggly, it blends really nicely with that body. We can get rid of some of those harsh noodle wraps there that look kind of gross. Once we pick out everything, it kind of all just blends into one really nice, smooth, buggy little head and shoulder section that then blends nicely into that body. And you end up with a little fly that rides hook point up. Will typically stand on its head a little bit because you got this nice little flat surface, and this little red tail sticks up and kind of just with the flow or whatever. Honestly, sometimes fish swimming around will kind of disturb the water and make this thing, if you're fishing in schools of carp like I often am, and once that thing gets good and wet, it has a ton of movement to it, those little rubber legs, it looks really realistic, and I've found that carp just hoover it right up. So this is one of my favorite carp patterns, tied for AZ Fly Shop.